Here's a sentence that should unsettle every executive currently prepping for a performance review cycle. Your dashboard has never once told you what's about to happen. Not one time, not in the history of dashboards. Dashboards are obituaries. They tell you what already died, a deal, a deadline, a relationship on your team, and they politely tell you professionally and if weeks after you could have done anything about it. I learned that lesson standing in a leadership meeting years ago, watching a room full of genuinely smart, genuinely well-intentioned people look directly at a warning sign and call it noise. Nobody in that room was negligent. Nobody was incompetent. They simply hadn't been trained to see it as a pattern. They saw it as an isolated event, filed it, and moved on to the next agenda item. That gap between people who see events and people who see patterns is, I'd argue, the single most underpriced skill in executive leadership today. Not confidence, not charisma, not even strategic vision, exactly, though it's its close cousin. Pattern recognition, the ability to notice that this missed deadline, that stalled promotion, and this unusually quiet team member on your Tuesday call are not three separate stories. They're one story told 3 times, waiting patiently for someone to listen. Today, I want to hand you the exact tool I use to catch that story before it finishes writing itself. And I want to show you in real detail what it looks like when leaders miss it and what it costs them. This is Holding the Room. I'm Melissa Sierra, and let's get into it today. Welcome back to Holding the Room. If this is your first time with us, here's the short version of who's talking to you. I split my time between 2 worlds that most people assume don't talk to each other. On one side, I lead business intelligence for a media organization here in New York, which means I live inside real data, real dashboards, and the actual operational machinery of the company every single day. It's not theoretical for me. I've built the systems, I've defended the numbers to skeptical leadership, and I've watched good data get misused by good people more times than I can count. On the other side, I coach executives and growth stage CEOs through my practice, Native Authority for Tech Leaders, and through a smaller application-only group I run called the Operators Intelligence Council. I get asked fairly often, which of those 2 identities is the real one? As if I have to pick. I don't. And the reason I don't is the entire premise of the show. The patterns I watch break in a Tuesday morning boardroom are, without exaggeration, the same patterns I watch break on a Thursday late afternoon coaching call. Different industries, different job titles, same underlying architecture of human behavior. Once you learn to see the architecture, you start seeing it everywhere, and you can never fully unsee it ever again. Today's conversation is about pattern recognition, specifically why it separates the executives who create opportunity from the executives who merely manage what's already sitting right in front of them. We're going to talk about why that distinction matters more, not less, in an AI-saturated environment, where information has never been cheaper and interpretation has never been more expensive. We're going to talk through what I've personally been seeing this week across coaching conversations, corporate leadership, and executive teams. I'm not directly part of, but hear about secondhand constantly, because that's what happens when you spend your life in this particular intersection. I'm going to walk you through 3 coaching stories in real depth, composites, with details changed to protect the people inside them, but every pattern in them is unmodified and real. And I'm going to tell you a story from my early on corporate career that I have never fully told on this show before, and the exact moment I learned in a very expensive way that a dashboard is always the last thing in the building to know anything. By the end of this episode, you'll walk away with a 5-letter framework you can use in your very next meeting. Today, if you have one, and a question I want you to sit with long after you've closed the app and moved on to whatever's next on your calendar. One more thing before we dive in, because I think it's the honest premise underneath everything else I'm about to say to you today. I don't think pattern recognition is a rare, innate gift some leaders are simply born with and others aren't. I've watched people who consider themselves not detail-oriented become exceptional within a matter of months, once they had a repeatable process to hang it on instead of relying on gut instinct alone. That's the entire point of naming the framework in the first place. Instinct is real and it matters, but instinct that can't be taught, repeated, or handed to your team is just luck and a nicer suit. Let's start where I always start with on this show, with an observation from my leadership laboratory. Scientists don't become experts because every experiment succeeds. If anything, the opposite is closer to true. They become experts because every experiment, successful or not, reveals another piece of the pattern underneath the results. A failed experiment isn't wasted data. It's a clue that was expensive to earn and frankly, cheap to ignore, which is exactly why so many people ignore it. Leadership works the same way, almost embarrassingly. So once you notice it, every difficult meeting, every missed promotion, every delayed decision, every unexpected success that nobody can quite explain afterward. These are not isolated incidents floating independently in your professional history. They're data points in a longitudinal study you've been unconsciously running on yourself and your organization for years. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most leaders are sitting on a decade or more of this data, and they have never once gone back and actually read it. I want to be honest about why that is, because it's not laziness, and it's not a character flaw. We don't ignore these clues because we don't care. We ignore them because pattern recognition requires something our calendars are actively, structurally designed to punish: stillness. You cannot recognize a pattern while sprinting from your 3rd meeting of the morning to your 4th. Patterns do not reveal themselves at a sprint. They only reveal themselves in a pause, the 2 minutes after a meeting ends, before you open the next tab, when you let yourself actually ask, wait, have I seen this exact shape before? Which brings us to the framework I built specifically to protect that pause. The PRISM framework. I built this framework because I got tired, genuinely, personally tired of watching brilliant people mistake reaction speed for decision quality. Those are not the same skill. They are not even close to the same skill. And the uncomfortable truth is that most organizations are only set up to reward the first one. Fast is visible. Fast gets praised in the all hands. Good is often invisible until 18 months later, when nobody remembers to connect the outcome back to the original decision. Let me walk you through all 5 letters with a small worked example for each one, because I found the framework only becomes usable once you've watched it applied to something concrete. P is for pause before reacting. Not forever. I'm not going to tell you to sit on decisions for a week out of some misguided sense of caution. Usually, pause means something closer to 90 seconds, just long enough to ask yourself one honest question before you open your mouth in that meeting. Is this actually new information, or have I genuinely seen this before, wearing a slightly different outfit? Say a client cancels a renewal call for the 3rd time this quarter, citing scheduling. The reactive response is to reschedule and move on. The pause response is to notice you're about to reschedule a pattern, not a single event. R is for recognize recurring behaviors instead of isolated events. One late deliverable on its own tells you almost nothing. People get sick, priorities shift, life happens. 3 late deliverables from 3 different people on 3 different teams, all quietly citing the same upstream dependency, is not 3 coincidences. It's one pattern with 3 witnesses, and it is very rarely a people problem when it shows up in that shape. I is for interpret what those behaviors are actually trying to tell you. This is the step almost everyone skips, and it's the one that turns raw pattern recognition into usable intelligence. Most executives are perfectly capable of collecting a pattern. They notice it, they even mention it out loud in a meeting, and then they file it under noted and never ask the follow-up question. What is this actually telling me about the system underneath it? S is separate meaningful signals from background noise. And I want to be careful here, because pattern recognition can absolutely be overused into a kind of paranoid overreading of everything. Not everything that repeats is significant. Some things repeat simply because they're generally annoying and low stakes, not because they're structurally important. Learning the difference, that's a huge part of what separates senior judgment from junior anxiety. A practical filter I use: does this pattern touch trust, money, or people leaving? If yes, it almost always earns further attention. If the honest answer is, this just mildly irritates me, it's very likely noise, and treating it like signal will burn credibility you'll want later for something that actually matters. M is for move before certainty arrives. This is the letter that scares people the most, and it's usually the one I spend the most time coaching on. Executives are not paid to wait patiently for perfect information before acting. That is, quite literally, not the job. We are paid to make better decisions with incomplete information than our competitors make with complete information, delivered a quarter too late. Waiting for certainty isn't caution. Very often, it's just a more comfortable feeling form of procrastination, dressed up in the language of due diligence so it doesn't feel like avoidance. I want to be fair to the discomfort here because it's real. Moving before certainty means occasionally being wrong in front of people whose opinion of you matters. That's a genuine cost, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But the alternative cost, moving only after certainty arrives, is invisible, which is exactly what makes it so dangerous. Nobody puts, we waited 4 extra weeks and it cost us the best version of the outcome on a slide. That cost never shows up anywhere except in the results you didn't get, quietly, permanently, without ever being named as a decision at all. Hold that framework loosely in your mind as we move through the rest of this episode. We are going to run every single story I'm about to tell you through all 5 letters in real time, so you can see exactly how it works when the stakes are real and the outcome wasn't obvious in advance. Let me show you all 5 letters working together in one compressed example before we go deep on the individual stories. So the shape of the whole sequence is fresh in your mind. Imagine a director on your team quietly stops volunteering ideas in your weekly leadership sync. One meeting, you'd shrug it off. Maybe they're tired. Maybe the agenda didn't touch their area. Pause. You notice yourself about to shrug it off and you don't quite yet. Recognize. You scroll back mentally and realize this is the 3rd meeting in a row, not the 1st. Interpret. Silence from someone who used to speak up isn't neutral. It's a withdrawal of discretionary effort. And discretionary effort is almost always the first thing people quietly pull back before anything more dramatic happens. Separate. You check whether this is company-wide fatigue. It isn't. It's isolated to this one person. Move. Instead of waiting for a formal one-on-one 2 weeks out, you send a 2-line message that same afternoon. No agenda attached to it, just checking in. That's the entire sequence, start to finish, in under 5 minutes of actual thinking time. It's not complicated. It's rarely practiced on purpose. Let's dig in to my leadership laboratory from this week. Every episode I pull directly from whatever has actually crossed my desk in the last 7 days, not case studies pulled from a textbook somewhere, but real current signals from real conversations I've had in rooms and on calls this week. This time, 3 patterns kept resurfacing in industries that on paper have nothing to do with each other. That repetition across unrelated contexts is itself worth paying attention to. If the same shape shows up in a media company, a healthcare startup, and a compliance tech firm in the same 7-day window, it's probably not a coincidence about any one of those industries. It's probably a pattern about how organizations are functioning right now, broadly, in this exact moment. Pattern 1. Information isn't the bottleneck anymore. Interpretation is. I want you to actually sit with that sentence, because I think most organizations are still right now solving the problem we had 5 years ago. Calendars are overflowing. Inboxes have become a second full-time job that nobody was hired for. And now, layered directly on top of that, we've added AI tools that can summarize a 90-minute meeting into 6 crisp bullet points in 11 seconds flat. That should have solved the problem. And yet, this week alone, I watched senior, capable professionals manually reconstruct long conversations from memory, laboriously, by hand, because they didn't trust the automated summary, or worse, They didn't know what to actually ask it for. One of the prompts I handed a client this week, someone who was drowning in exactly this, was almost embarrassingly simple, and yet it changed their week immediately. 4 questions asked of any AI-generated meeting summary before you allow yourself to move on to the next thing. What happened? Why did it happen? What decisions actually need to be made as a result? And this one, everybody skips every single time. By whom? That last question is the one that actually moves the work forward. Because a decision without a named owner isn't a decision. It's a suggestion wearing a decision's clothing. AI shouldn't replace your thinking, and frankly, it can't. Its entire value proposition is removing the friction that currently sits between you and the thinking you are already fully capable of doing. Here's the concrete version of that, so it's not abstract for you. This client was walking into every Monday with 11 unread meeting summaries from the previous week, all technically informative. None of them acted on. We didn't add a tool. We added the 4-question pass, done once on a Friday afternoon before the weekend, instead of Monday morning under pressure. 11 summaries became 4 actual decisions with 4 named owners, and the other 7 were on inspection, simply informational, nothing to act on at all, which was itself useful to know. The volume of information hadn't changed by a single email. The interpretation layer had. Pattern 2. Organizations continue evaluating people while quietly, almost systematically, ignoring the systems those same people are working inside of. This one shows up constantly in my business intelligence work, and it shows up just as often in a slightly different costume in coaching. Fragmented data living across 4 different tools that were never designed to talk to each other. Multiple conflicting versions of the truth, entirely dependent on which dashboard someone happens to have open when the question is being asked. Legacy systems groaning underneath workloads they were never architected to carry, patched together with workarounds that everyone quietly knows are workarounds. And then, this is the part that should genuinely stop every executive reading a stack of reviews this quarter. We sit that same overwhelmed, resourceful employee down across the table and evaluate their output as though the system surrounding them were a neutral, invisible backdrop. It raises a question I don't think gets often asked nearly enough during the review season. If the systems haven't scaled at the same pace as the organization, what exactly are we measuring when we score someone's performance? Are we measuring capability, or are we measuring someone's raw personal ability to survive unnecessary complexity and still somehow hit the deadline anyway? Those are 2 genuinely different competencies. And I would argue we are consistently rewarding the second one in performance review after performance review, while sincerely believing we're measuring the first. Great leaders evaluate people. Exceptional leaders evaluate the systems those people are standing inside of first, before they ever pick up the scorecard and start writing. I saw a version of this play out this week in a conversation about a team that was, on paper, underperforming against its targets for the second quarter running. The instinct in the room was to talk about coaching plans for 2 specific individuals. When we actually mapped the workflow, both of those individuals were spending roughly a third of their week manually reconciling data between two systems that had never been properly integrated after a merger 18 months earlier. Nobody had ever fixed the integration because it wasn't anyone's explicit job to fix it, and everyone had quietly adapted around it instead. The coaching plan conversation evaporated the moment that became visible. The real fix cost a few weeks of engineering time. The alternative, coaching two people for a problem that was never theirs, would have cost something much harder to get back. Pattern 3. Deadlines are about identity, not simply about delivery. This one is more personal, and I think it's the pattern most leaders underestimate the most, myself included, in earlier years. When you choose to live inside what I call a leadership laboratory, treating your career as an ongoing, deliberate experiment rather than a fixed script someone handed to you at orientation, every single commitment you make becomes a small, quiet deposit into your own reputation. Your calendar technically belongs to your employer. It always will, structurally. Your reputation does not belong to your employer. It never has. It belongs entirely to you, and it is built brick by brick out of the promises your present self chooses to keep or chooses to quietly break on behalf of a future self who isn't in the room to advocate for themselves yet. None of this, to be very clear, means we lower the bar on excellence. Empathy and accountability are not opposites. Whatever 1,000 well-meaning posts have implied about leadership this year, the strongest leaders I know personally hold both of these things at once without contradiction. They expect real excellence consistently, and they are also honest enough with themselves to recognize when it's an outdated system, not a lack of effort, that's quietly driving the miss. I'll give you the smallest possible version of this pattern because it's the one I catch myself doing. Every time I commit to a deadline, manuscript, a proposal, a deliverable for a client, some small part of me is quietly asking whether this is a promise I'm making to be liked in this specific moment, or a promise I actually intend to keep 3 weeks from now when it seems inconvenient. Those are different promises, even though they sound identical out loud. Leaders who live inside a leadership laboratory learn to hear the difference in their own voice before anyone else ever has to point it out to them. Those are the 3 patterns from this week's lab. Now, let's get into the observation overall. I want to add one more observation before we move into today's stories, because it ties the 3 weekly patterns together into something a little larger. We are living through a genuinely strange moment for pattern recognition as a leadership skill. On one hand, AI tools are getting remarkably good at detecting statistical patterns in data. Anomalies, trends, correlations buried in numbers too large for any human to hold in their head. But on the other hand, the kind of pattern recognition I've been describing all episode, 3 department leads using the same tired phrase, 4 fires wearing the same costume, a director going quiet in meetings, has nothing to do with statistics at all. It's relational. It's contextual. It requires having been in the room more than once and remembering what the room felt like the last time you were in it. That's not a skill any tool is going to hand you this year or frankly any year soon, which means the leaders who desperately and deliberately sharpen this exact skill on purpose are about to become disproportionately more valuable, not less, precisely because everything around them is getting faster and more automated. The tools will keep getting better at telling you what happened in the data. They will not tell you what we're managing, said 3 times with the same tired laugh, actually means. That's still entirely on us. Now, let's go inside the actual rooms while I watch this all play out. Starting with a story from much earlier in my own career that I've genuinely never told in full on this show. Earlier in my career in business, I was handed what looked like on paper the easiest project I'd had in over a year. A retention dashboard, clean data source, well-established metrics, a team that had built earlier versions of essentially this exact thing before. I remember sitting down with a project brief and genuinely thinking it would take 3 weeks, maybe less, if the source data behaved itself. About a week in, something small started bothering me, and it took me a few days to even name what that exactly was. It wasn't the numbers. The numbers looked completely fine. Well, within normal range. Nothing flagged it. It was a comment, or more precisely, the same comment, said 3 separate times by 3 different department leads in 3 unconnected meetings that same week. When I asked how their teams were doing heading into a system migration, all 3 of them used almost the exact identical phrase. We're managing, not we're gate, not we're struggling. We're managing, said every single time with a small tired laugh at the end of it, like a period at the end of the sentence nobody wanted to finish. I remember the 3rd time I heard it especially clearly because it happened in a hallway, not in a scheduled meeting. I'd stopped one of the department leads to ask a quick clarifying question about a data field. And almost as an afterthought, I asked, how was the migration going for her? She gave me the same small laugh the other 2 had given, almost word for word. We're managing. Then she paused, glanced back towards her team's section of the floor, and added quietly, ask me again in a month. I wrote that down the second I got back to my desk because it didn't sound like someone describing a temporary rough patch. It sounded like someone making a date on a calendar they hadn't told anyone else about yet. If I had been operating purely off the dashboard in front of me, I would have had 0 reason to flag anything at all. Retention numbers were with normal range. Engagement scores at that exact moment were technically fine. Every single quantitative signal available to me on paper said, nothing to see here, move along, ship the dashboard. But by then, I'd already started learning the slow way that dashboards tell you what already happened, while conversations tell you what's about to happen. And we're managing, repeated almost word for word by 3 department leads with no reason to have coordinated their language, was not a coincidence. It was one pattern wearing 3 different names and 3 different faces. I want to be precise about what I actually did next, because I don't want this to sound like a heroic hunch I acted out of nowhere on. I ran, in essence, the exact PRISM sequence I just walked you through, years before I had a name for it. I paused instead of quietly closing out the dashboard project as green and on track, which was the easy, defensible move. I recognized the recurring behavior, that specific phrase, that specific tired laugh, 3 separate times in 5 business days. I interpreted it. People who are genuinely fine reach for good or great, full stop, without qualification. Where managing is the sound of someone consciously downgrading their honest answer into something small and safe enough for a status meeting. I separated it from noise. I actually went and checked whether this was simply a company-wide verbal habit, something meaningless, and it wasn't. It was tightly concentrated in exactly the departments carrying the heaviest share of that quarter's system migration. And then finally, I moved. Before the quarterly retention numbers gave me anything official permission to. I flagged it upward as an early attrition risk tied specifically to change fatigue 3 to 4 full weeks before it would have surfaced into any retention metric we were formally tracking on that dashboard. It did eventually show up in the numbers, exactly as I feared, concentrated in the department that absorbed the migration the hardest. But by the time it did, leadership already had a targeted retention conversation in motion. Budget already allocated because we had caught the pattern in the conversation layer instead of waiting patiently for it to surface in the data layer 3 or 4 weeks later. That gap doesn't sound especially dramatic when I say it out loud like this. In organizational terms, though, it is the entire difference between a proactive, well-resourced retention conversation and a stack of exit interviews conducted after the fact, with a straight face, asking people why they left. That single project taught me something I have genuinely never stopped applying since, whether I'm sitting in a boardroom meeting or on a coaching call. The dashboard is always the last thing in the building to know anything. If you are only leading from what the dashboard is currently telling you, you are, almost by mathematical definition, always leading from the recent past and calling it the present. I want to pause here for a moment because I've told you the version of this skill that lives inside my own career. I think it's worth showing you what the exact same instinct looks like from the other side of the table. Not as a person running the dashboard, but as a person sitting across from a leader trying to figure out why their own career or their own business keeps hitting the same wall in a slightly different place each time. That's where the coaching stories come in. And I've chosen these 3 deliberately because each one shows a different presenting problem, making that exact skill underlying gap. The inability to see a pattern until it's spelled out for you. Let's hone in on the first one. This was an executive who was trusted with everything except strategy. A senior operator came to me convinced their problem was executive presence. That was almost word for word the language they used in our very first conversation together. I don't think I project enough presence in the room. They had watched 2 peers get pulled into strategic planning meetings. They themselves kept quietly, consistently getting left out of, despite doing by every measurable standard available to either of us, noticeably stronger work. If I had taken that presenting problem at face value, which is frankly the easier and more comfortable path for a coach to take, because the client hands it to you prepackaged, we would have spent our first 6 sessions together working on posture, pacing, and how to hold a confident pause before answering a difficult question in a room full of senior people. Those are useful skills, genuinely, but they would have been the wrong diagnosis entirely, treating a symptom that wasn't actually the disease. Instead, our second session, I asked them to walk me through in detail the last 5 times leadership had specifically brought them into a room. Not 5 general meetings, 5 distinct moments where leadership had deliberately pulled them in. Every single instance, without exception, turned out to be execution related. Fix this, fix it fast, fix it quietly, without drama. Every single instance they had delivered cleanly, without needing to be managed through it, without escalation, without compliance. And there was the actual pattern, sitting in plain sight the entire time, hiding in a story the client themselves had never once stopped to lay out chronologically before that session. Leadership had learned through pure reputation that this was the person you hand a fire to. What leaders had never once had the occasion to learn, because they never actually seen it, was whether this person, this same person, could sit in a room before there was a fire and help decide which fires were even worth fighting in the first place. Executive presence wasn't the gap. A track record in an entirely different kind of room was the gap. Nobody in leadership had ever watched them operate anywhere except squarely inside a crisis. And you cannot infer strategic judgment from crisis management alone, no matter how well the crisis gets handled. We ran it deliberately through the framework together, out loud in a session. Pause. Stop assuming the story was fundamentally about how they showed up physically in a room and start asking a more useful question. What data did leadership actually have access to about this person? Full stop. Recognize every single strategic conversation they'd been excluded from followed the exact same shape. Early stage, genuinely ambiguous, no clear fire yet identified. Interpret, they had been typecast by leadership, not undervalued by them. A subtle but enormously important distinction, because typecasting is solvable and undervaluing often isn't. Separate. This was not, underneath it all, a confidence problem, a likability problem, or a competence problem. It was specifically an exposure problem. Leadership simply did not have the evidence yet. Move. Rather than continuing to patiently wait to be invited into ambiguity, they began proactively bringing one clear, unprompted point of view to leadership on an unresolved, non-urgent issue. About once every 2 weeks, on a deliberate cadence, low stakes by design, no fire attached on purpose, just a slowly accumulating demonstrated pattern of thinking before the crisis arrives, not merely during it. 4 months later, they were sitting in the room. Not because they suddenly became more confident or worked on their posture or learned to hold a longer pause. Because they had deliberately given leadership an entirely new pattern to recognize. One data point at a time on their own initiative. What I keep coming back to about this story is how close it came to going differently. If they'd walked into our first session and I simply agreed with the presenting problem, if I'd said, sure, let's work on your presence, we would have spent months polishing a skill that was never actually broken, while the real gap sat there, untouched, quietly reinforcing itself with every new fire they were handed and successfully put out. The most expensive coaching mistake isn't giving bad advice. It's giving good advice to the wrong problem. Let's pivot to the next story. The leader who blamed the technology. Another client came to me absolutely certain that AI adoption was the direct source of their team's growing frustration. Their organization had rolled out several new AI-assisted tools over the previous 2 quarters, and by their own account, things had gotten measurably harder, not easier in that window. More noise in the system, more half-finished summaries circulating without clear ownership, more meetings that technically ended with everyone nodding along and somehow nobody actually agreeing afterward on what had actually just been decided. Their instinct, which on the surface is a genuinely reasonable one, and I want to validate that before I tell you why it turned out to be wrong, was that the technology itself had been poorly implemented and that the fix was going to be better training, tighter onboarding, or possibly switching to a different tool entirely and starting over. I asked them to send me 3 recent real AI-generated meeting summaries their team had actually used that week unedited. All 3 of them were honestly quite well written. Clear language, accurate content, reasonably concise. Nothing to complain about from a purely quality standpoint. The technology, in a very real sense, had done its job. What none of the 3 summaries did, because it generally is not a summarizations tool's job to do it, no matter how sophisticated the tool becomes, was translate, here is what was discussed, into here is what the organization is now actually going to do about it and who specifically owns it. That translation step had always, in this particular organization, been performed implicitly live in the room by whichever senior person happened to be present. Usually communicated through tone and body language, far more than through explicit spoken words. The older, slower meetings had a built-in human translator that nobody had ever had to formally name or acknowledge because it happened automatically as the byproduct of the room's natural pace. The newer, faster AI-assisted meetings had inadvertently removed the friction that used to force that translation to happen out loud. And critically, nothing had been deliberately put in its place to replace it. This was never, underneath the surface complaint, a technology problem at all. It was a missing step problem that the organization's old, slower process had been quietly, accidentally covering for the entire time, without anyone realizing a step was even being performed. We ran it through PRISM together in a session. Pause. Stop treating the tool feels broken as automatic, self-evident proof that the tool is actually broken. Recognize the confusion clustered very specifically around meetings with more than one plausible next step, not around every meeting uniformly. Just the genuinely ambiguous ones. Interpret. Speed had quietly outplaced clarity because a small but essential human translation step had disappeared without anyone noticing it had ever existed in the first place. Separate. This was never really about AI summary accuracy at all. It was a pre-existing decision ownership gap that the AI tool had simply made visible faster than the old process had. Move. They added one deliberate, non-negotiable line to end of every AI summarized meeting going forward. A specifically named owner and one plain sentence describing the next action said out loud before anyone was allowed to leave that room. The tool itself never changed, not one setting. The frustration mostly disappeared within about 3 weeks because the real problem had never actually been the technology sitting in front of everyone. It had been one small, invisible step that only became visible at all when something else sped up dramatically around it. I think about this story every time I hear a leader announce with real conviction that AI broke our process. Very often, what actually happened is that AI simply removed the padding around the process that was already fragile, and the fragility just became visible for the first time. Blaming the tool is understandable. It's the newest variable, so it's the easiest thing to point at. It's also, more often than not, exactly wrong. As we transition into the third story, this is about a founder who kept solving the wrong problem. The third story involves a founder navigating a significant transition, expanding an engagement well past its original narrow scope into a much longer, higher stakes chapter of simultaneously building a business and a public voice. Early on, nearly every single session opened the exact way, a fresh tactical fire presented with real urgency, a content calendar that suddenly wasn't converting the way it had been, an outreach sequence that had gone quiet, a pipeline that looked genuinely full on paper and felt in practice entirely empty at the exact moment it needed to produce something. Each fire, taken entirely on its own, looked like a distinct, self-contained, solvable problem, deserving its own distinct tactical fix. Fix the content approach, fix the outreach cadence, fix the intake process. And each time we successfully fixed one of them, another appeared within a few weeks in roughly the same underlying shape, simply wearing a different name and living in a different part of the business. That specific repetition, not any single fire on its own, was the actual signal worth paying attention to. 4 apparently different tactical problems, all tracing back, once we actually laid them side by side, to the exact same unaddressed root. This founder hadn't yet decided clearly, specifically, and in writing who precisely they were building for and why that particular person should trust them over every credible option currently available to them. Every single tactic downstream of that one unanswered question was always going to underperform structurally, no matter how skillfully it was executed, because it was aimed at a target that had never actually been named out loud. We deliberately slowed everything down, paused, stopped treating every new fire as an entirely new problem requiring an entirely new, bespoke tactic. Recognize 4 seemingly unrelated issues, once laid out chronologically, shared the exact same underlying shape. Interpret. This was a positioning gap, not primarily an execution gap. The tactic themselves were mostly fine on their own merits. The target they were aimed at, though, was blurry. Separate. Carefully distinguish genuine, isolated tactical misses from symptoms of one much larger, unresolved strategic question sitting underneath all of them. Move. Before touching a single additional tactic, we built out one clear, specific, written answer to who exactly this founder serves and why. And only after that answer existed did we go back and rebuild the content strategy, the outreach approach, and the intake process, all around that one shared answer, instead of around 4 separate, disconnected best guesses made under pressure. 6 months in, the fires had largely stopped appearing. Not because execution had suddenly, mysteriously improved on its own, but because every single tactic was now finally aimed at the same clearly named target. That's the patterns most founders miss when they're under real pressure and moving fast. When the same fire keeps reappearing in the slightly new costume, the fire itself is rarely the actual problem worth solving. Usually, the problem is just very good at its job. 3 stories, 3 completely different industries, 3 completely different presenting problems. A person, a piece of technology, and a business model. And underneath every single one of them, the exact same 5-letter sequence. Pause, recognize, interpret, separate, and move. Once you start looking for this shape, you will start seeing it everywhere in your own week. And fair warning, you won't be able to stop. Before we get to today's closing framework, I want to answer a question that came in after a recent episode, because it connects directly to everything we just walked through. And I suspect a lot of you are silently asking some version of it too. The question, paraphrased: this all makes sense in theory, but how do you tell the difference between genuine pattern recognition and just being a pessimist who assumes the worst every time something repeats twice? It's a fair challenge, and I don't want to wave it away. Here's my honest answer. Pessimism assumes a conclusion and then goes hunting for the evidence to confirm it. Pattern recognition, done properly, does the opposite. It starts with the evidence sitting right in front of you, and only then asks what conclusion the evidence actually supports. The difference isn't how alert you are. It's in the order of operations. There's a simple test I give clients who are worried about this exact thing. Before you act on a pattern, ask yourself honestly, could I explain this pattern out loud to the person involved using only things they said or did, not things I'm inferring about their character or their motives? If your explanation of the pattern requires guessing at someone's intentions, you're probably drifting from pattern recognition into pessimism, or even into something closer to mind reading. If your explanation only requires pointing at repeated, observable behavior, 3 late deliverables, 3 identical phrases, 4 recurring tactical fires, you're almost certainly on solid ground. I'll also add this. Real pattern recognition is just as willing to notice good patterns as bad ones. The client I mentioned earlier, the one whose team kept getting typecast into execution-only rooms, The flip side of that was leadership trusted them completely under pressure with zero hand-holding every single time. That's not a small thing. That's a genuine strength, clearly documented across 5 separate instances. Pessimism only collects the bad news. Pattern recognition collects all of it and lets the evidence sort itself out. A second question came in that I want to fold into the same answer because they're really the same concern wearing 2 different outfits. What if I flag a pattern to my leadership and I'm wrong? And my honest answer to that is that being occasionally wrong is the cost of doing this at all. And it's much smaller than you're imagining. Notice how I framed the retention story from earlier. I didn't march into leadership meeting and announce a crisis. I flagged an early risk with the specific behavioral evidence attached to it and let leadership weigh it against everything else they knew. That's the move. You are not claiming certainty. You're surfacing a well-supported hypothesis earlier than the data would have ever surfaced it on its own. And you're doing it with enough humility built in that being wrong costs you almost nothing, while being right, even occasionally, compounds your credibility every single time. Before we close out today's episode, I want to leave you with 5 questions. I ask some version of these in every strategic coaching conversation that I have, without exception. And I'd ask of my own leadership, honestly, at least once a quarter. Strategy. What reoccurring issue in your world genuinely deserves a real strategic solution instead of the 4th workaround in a row that's technically getting you through the week? Workaround feels productive in the moment. They are, very often, just interest payments on a debt you haven't acknowledged yet. Think about the founder in our 3rd story today. 4 separate tactical rescues, none of which address the actual debt, which was unanswered positioning question sitting quietly underneath all the 4 fires. Visibility. What do people consistently come to you for advice about? Entirely unprompted, without you ever having marketed yourself in that direction. That pattern isn't random, and it's not accidental. That's the market. Your internal market, your colleagues, your network, already telling you repeatedly where your real authority actually lives, whether or not it matches your job title. I'd bet most of you listening could name this in under 10 seconds if I asked you directly right now. Relationships. Which relationships in your professional life repeatedly create real opportunity for you? And just as importantly, which ones repeatedly create friction, drama, or drag? Most people, once I ask this directly, can answer instantly, almost reflexively. Most people, remarkably, have simply never been asked the question out loud before, which tells you something on its own about how we rarely audit our own relationship patterns with any intention. Execution. Which specific process in your organization keeps breaking for the same underlying reason, no matter who happens to be running it that quarter? I want you to really sit with that phrase. No matter who's running it. That's the tell. That's not a people problem. However, tempting it is to name a person as the cause. Say it with me one more time. This is a systems problem, and it will keep reappearing wearing different names until it's treated as one. That was almost word for word the retention story I told you earlier from my own corporate history. Results. This last one is the hardest, and it's the one I want you to genuinely sit with the longest. Are you currently measuring activity, or are you measuring meaningful progress? Those two things can produce remarkably similar looking dashboards in any given quarter, full of green check marks and completed tasks, and yet they quietly produce very, very different careers over a 5 or 10-year horizon. A full calendar is not the same thing as a full pipeline. A busy team is not automatically a productive one. The dashboard, once again, will be the very last thing to tell you the difference. Here is what I generally want you to sit with this week, longer than the runtime of this single episode. What recurring frustration have you quietly accepted as simply normal, filed away without much thought as just how is it around here? That might actually be revealing a broken system underneath it, and not a personal weakness in you or anyone else at all. Write it down. Somewhere you'll actually see it again. Don't try to solve it yet. Resist that urge. It's premature. Just notice it clearly in writing. Noticing deliberately and on purpose is step one of the entire framework, and is the step almost everyone tries to skip. If you want a place to start, borrow the same question I asked myself standing in that hallway years ago. Is there a phrase, an excuse, or a small ritual of avoidance that keeps showing up around the exact same topic, told by different people in different rooms, using suspiciously similar language? That repetition rarely is about the topic itself. It's almost always about something underneath the topic that nobody has yet been given permission or reason to say out loud. Holding the room has never been about walking into a room already holding every answer. It's about always recognizing the pattern before everyone else in that room even realizes they're standing inside of one. The leaders who consistently create the most opportunity for themselves and for the people around them don't simply react faster than everyone else in the building. They see differently, structurally, as a habit rather than a talent. And when you genuinely see differently, you inevitably, eventually, start to lead differently too, often before you can fully explain why. If today's episode gave you language for something you've been sensing but couldn't quite name, do me a favor. Before you move on to whatever's next in your queue, send it to the one person in your world who's currently stuck inside a pattern they can't see yet. Not as a hint, but as a gift. That's usually how the best conversations in this show's history have started. And if you want to keep building this skill with me, subscribe wherever you're listening right now, so the next episode lands in your feed the moment it's ready. We'll be back soon, staying inside the Leadership Laboratory with another set of patterns pulled straight from this week's actual conversations. Not theory, not a textbook, just what's actually crossing my desk. Until next time, keep building your Leadership Laboratory, one deliberate observation at a time. Keep creating more opportunity than you consume for yourself and for the people counting on you. And remember, your future self is already being shaped quietly right now in this exact moment by the patterns you choose to notice today. I'm Melissa Sierra, and this has been Holding the Room. Thanks for joining.